There was nothing unusual about Dorian Brandt that morning, not in his appearance, his demeanor, or the way he carried himself through JFK's Terminal 4. His suit was pressed to perfection. His collar hugged his neck with the familiarity of decades in boardrooms and on red-eye flights. In his left hand, he held a dark leather garment bag. In his right, a first-class boarding pass to San Francisco, where he was set to deliver the keynote at the Western Produce Sustainability Summit. At 58, this routine was second nature. Airports, early mornings, quiet transitions from one coast to another. Dorian never needed fanfare. He preferred precision, professionalism, and silence over spectacle. But that morning, something shifted, a weight in the air, almost imperceptible, until it hit with the sting of familiarity. When he approached Gate 17, the line hadn't yet formed. Just a few scattered travelers sipping coffee, scrolling, unaware of the moment that was about to unfold. Dorian walked up to the gate agent, a young woman with quick eyes and stiff posture. He gave her a polite nod and handed her his boarding pass. She didn't scan it. Instead, she looked up at him, then looked again, slower this time. The kind of double-take born not of confusion, but of judgment. He waited, steady, calm, not a hint of impatience. Her words came clipped. "This lane is for premium passengers only." Dorian replied without pause. "I know." Still, she hesitated, finally scanning the pass, then pausing again, hand hovering above the scanner. As if unsure, she turned to whisper to her colleague, who stole a glance at Dorian over her shoulder. Something unspoken passed between them, something old and familiar to him. Then came the request, "I'm going to need to see some ID." Dorian tilted his head ever so slightly. "You don't usually ask for ID when scanning a pass. Is there a problem?" The agent replied that it was a security measure. But Dorian knew better. So did she. There was no such policy. He retrieved his ID anyway, placing it gently on the counter. She held it awkwardly, like it didn't fit the scene she had imagined, then walked away without another word, leaving him standing there, not loud, not combative, just present. A security officer appeared moments later. No words, just presence. That's how it always began, not with accusations, but with assumptions, not with policies, but postures. Dorian stepped back, quietly, away from the gate, away from the moment they clearly wanted him to escalate. But he didn't give them the performance they expected. He didn't raise his voice or wave his arms. He pulled out his phone. "One call, that's all it took. Maggie, it's me. I need you to pull up the catering contract with Horizon Air, the one for the Western routes." "Yeah, I'm at JFK. Gate 17. I'll hold." Calm, poised, and still as stone. Because Dorian Brandt had learned long ago that when you walk into rooms people think you don't belong in, your silence has to be sharper than their doubt. And sometimes the loudest power is the one that never raises its voice. Dorian didn't need to shout to be heard. He never had. As he stood near Gate 17, boarding pass still in hand, his voice was calm but carried the weight of history, of 1,000 small slights, each one layered over the last. He wasn't new to moments like this. Moments where being successful, prepared, and polite weren't enough to shield him from the quiet sting of doubt. He'd lived it before, not often, but enough to recognize the pattern, the whispered glances, the unnecessary questions, the unspoken disbelief that someone like him could possibly belong where he stood. But Dorian Brandt had never let that disbelief define him. Instead, he built something bigger than doubt could reach. He came from Mansfield, Ohio, from a modest home where the floors creaked and the mornings were loud. His mother, Eunice, worked the produce section at a grocery store, and his father, Leonard, patched up cars between night shifts at the mill. They didn't have much, but they had enough, and they raised Dorian to believe that how you carry yourself matters more than what people expect of you. By the time he was 15, he was already up before dawn on Saturdays, helping his mother sort apples and inspect melons, learning the weight of work and the texture of integrity. That foundation carried him forward, from Kent State to the side of the highway where he first sold sweet corn from the back of a borrowed pickup. Chasing a dream no one else could see. He didn't start with investors or headlines, he started with bruised knuckles and second-hand tools. Building Brandt Global Foods from a garage with a crashing laptop and a stubborn belief that food should be grown clean and delivered fast. He didn't want to be boutique or trendy, he wanted to be real. And he was. For years, he drove across the Midwest forging relationships with farmers, earning trust not with titles, but with time. And now, decades later, his company wasn't just supplying fresh produce to local stores, it was on the trays of first-class cabins. In the lounges of national airlines, Horizon Air had come to him, seeking reinvention after backlash over their frozen meals and wasteful packaging. He hadn't pitched, he'd listened, then offered a solution: farm-to-airline sourcing, seasonal menus, sustainable packaging. They signed a $48 million contract without hesitation. And yet, here he was, denied the very seat he helped fill, judged not by merit but by presumption. Still, Dorian didn't lash out. He made one quiet call, not to demand, but to remind, because power, for him, was never loud. It was steady, grounded in legacy and lived experience. He didn't decorate his office with awards. Instead, he framed photos of that first produce stand and letters from grateful farmers. He didn't need to post about equity, he lived it. So as security watched him like a threat, as the gate agent second-guessed his every move, Dorian remained still, not because he was passive, but because he had already done the work. His presence was his protest. And that moment at Gate 17 wasn't the start of a confrontation, it was a quiet chance for the airline to recognize the man they had underestimated. It wasn't just about a boarding pass anymore, it never had been. At Gate 17, Dorian Brandt stood still, not as a symbol, not as a statement, but as a man who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of staying composed in the face of being doubted. The agent didn't know who he was, to her. He was just another passenger whose presence didn't fit the picture in her mind of what first class looked like. Her name was Haley, new to JFK, freshly transferred from Tulsa, eager to prove herself, clinging to procedure like a life raft. But what she lacked was not policy. It was perspective. She didn't yet know how to read a room, how to recognize the quiet command of someone who didn't need to speak to own a space. Even as passengers began lining up, murmuring with growing impatience, Dorian didn't budge. He was waiting, not for an apology, but for awareness. When Maggie called back, telling him she'd looped in the airline's regional VP and the head of food service integration, Dorian didn't gloat, he simply nodded. Calm, a man who understood how systems move when pressure is applied from the right place. But while he waited, the clock was ticking in other places. 10 floors above the terminal, Cynthia Reyes, the airline's executive director of regional operations, dropped her croissant and stood up straighter at the mention of Dorian's name. She didn't need the full story, just knowing it was him was enough to recognize the magnitude of the mistake. This wasn't a customer complaint. This was a quiet crisis unfolding beneath the polished surface of corporate structure. As Cynthia rushed down the hallway, heels clicking with urgency, other gears began to turn. In Minneapolis, Jack Reno nearly choked on his lunch when he learned Dorian had been flagged by security for no reason. There were press releases in queue, campaign videos in final edit, and Dorian Brandt, face of Horizon Air's fresh flight initiative, was standing on the wrong side of a gate. Meanwhile, down below, Haley was unraveling. She could feel the silence pressing in on her, the weight of Mia's eyes, the growing whispers from the boarding line, the tightening grip of her own uncertainty. And still, she held on to protocol like it could save her, scrolling through a screen, pretending to search for a reason that didn't exist. It was MIA who finally leaned over and said it. Do you realize who he is? That sentence landed like thunder. Haley's stomach flipped. Dorian Brandt, the name on the vendor list, the company that just signed a contract with them. Suddenly, the pieces snapped into place. But too late. Haley panicked, realizing any action now would look like retreat, like guilt. Her voice was gone. The supervisor's call came through her earpiece, requesting an update, reminding her that corporate execs were flying in that morning, no surprises allowed. But a surprise was already unfolding, and while Haley tried to keep her hands from shaking, while MIA exchanged no more words, only silence, Dorian moved a few feet away from the desk, not to escape, but to give space to the mistake revealing itself. He stood near the glass wall, watching the luggage carts pass slowly on the runway, still and unbothered, not because he didn't care, but because he knew that time was on his side. And the truth was about to catch up with everyone who thought he didn't belong. As Dorian stood a few feet away from the boarding gate, his presence began to echo louder than any words could. He wasn't just waiting for access to his seat, He was holding up a mirror to a moment that had already spiraled far beyond a misunderstanding. Cynthia Reyes, still steady in her role, tried to bridge the gap with professionalism, but Dorian wasn't interested in surface-level fixes. He leaned in slightly, not with aggression, but with precision, and asked again, not for an apology, but for insight, for accountability. Is this not a reflection of your company's values? Or is it simply a reflection of your gate agent's judgment? The question landed with such quiet force that no corporate script could deflect it. Dorian wasn't raising his voice, but his words rang out like a bell, impossible to unhear. He gestured subtly toward Haley, who now stood behind the desk with her badge gripped tightly in both hands like a shield against the truth. Her eyes had lost the edge they held earlier, now they looked hollow. The confidence drained by the realization of what she had misread, who she had underestimated. Dorian didn't look at her with anger, something colder replaced it, disappointment. The kind that lingers deeper, speaks louder, and doesn't need to be named. Then, without drama, he reached into his garment bag and pulled out a simple manila folder. No theatrics, just facts. Inside it was a signed contract, $48 million worth of fresh produce. Logistics and innovation. This is what my company delivers, he said evenly, placing the folder in Cynthia's hands. Not just to your flights, but to your lounges, to the very image you're trying to repair. And with that, the moment shifted once again, not into conflict, but into clarity. Dorian didn't want tweets or letters or grand displays of regret. He wanted better, because the next time someone who didn't look the part approached a gate, they might not have a direct line to the VP. And that was the point. Around them, the air had grown still. Passengers were no longer pretending not to notice. Phones were in hands, eyes were wide, and the silence was thunderous. One woman in the business class line was clearly recording the scene, her thumb moving slowly across the screen. Dorian, unmoved, glanced at his watch. Good, he said after Justin promised an immediate review. Then we can all go about our day. But before he stepped away, he turned to look at Haley one last time. No words passed between them, but the silence carried its own weight. It wasn't about revenge, it was about realization, about letting her sit with the consequences of a choice made in a moment of quiet bias. Cynthia gave the cue, and the flight crew unblocked the gate. As Dorian walked down the jet bridge, Justin followed close behind, but Dorian didn't need anyone to explain, protect, or amplify him. He had already spoken volumes, without ever needing to raise his voice. As Dorian stepped onto the plane, the air inside the cabin felt different, not the usual sterile calm of business travel, but something softer, quieter, like an unspoken apology carried on every breath. The flight attendant named Jordan greeted him not with robotic routine, but with gentle care, offering to take his garment bag, his voice low and reverent, as though he knew the story that had just unfolded at Gate 17. Another crew member quickly brought him a bottle of water, unasked, placing it by his seat like a peace offering. If there's anything you need, Mr. Brandt, just say the word, Jordan whispered, not out of obligation, but from a place of respect. Dorian didn't answer right away. He sat down in seat 1A, the very seat they'd told him wasn't for someone like him, and placed the water down untouched. His breath came slow and controlled, not from relief, but from muscle memory, the kind of deep, measured composure you learn when grace becomes your shield. Outside the plane, the world kept moving, but inside the terminal, something was shifting. The gate grew quiet, conversations hushed, flight monitors stalled, Gate 17 status flipped from boarding to delayed, and within minutes. So did two other nearby Horizon Air flights. The language was vague, operational hold, technical processing, but the reality was clear. Corporate had issued a soft shutdown. A pause in motion while they scrambled to assess just how far the damage had spread. Back in a glass-walled meeting room behind the terminal, Cynthia Reyes had already switched gears. Her heels were off, her voice clipped with urgency as she joined a call with legal, and crisis management. Logs were being pulled, staff questioned, every whisper and decision at Gate 17 being dissected in real time. The flight wouldn't leave until the company understood what had truly happened. They weren't trying to protect Dorian anymore, they were trying to protect themselves. And yet, back in seat 1A, Dorian closed his eyes, not to rest, but to center himself. This wasn't about anger, and it never had been. It was about the quiet ache that builds over years of being misread. The kind of ache that sits deeper than rage. Because it's wrapped in knowing. He thought of his father, Leonard, being turned away from a car dealership by a manager who never looked past his clothes. He remembered the investor meeting where someone handed him keys, assuming he was the valet. And now, even with millions in contracts and decades of impact behind him, he was still explaining his presence in rooms he had helped build. Jordan came back, hesitant but honest, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw what happened out there. It wasn't right. Dorian opened his eyes, not with surprise, but with the calm of a man who had heard it all before. Thank you, he said simply, and then Jordan added something unexpected. His younger brother had watched Dorian's talk at last year's sustainability conference. And it made him believe in a future in agriscience. That moment, small, human, pure, wasn't redemption. It was reminder that even when dignity is tested, impact still finds a way to grow.